Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or two. And while we're waiting, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know why you're joining today. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Liz Davis. I'm a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research and a task lead for the Works Clearinghouse's Statistics Website and Training, or SWOT contract, leading the development of improvements and enhancements to the online study review guide, or OSRG. On behalf of the Institute for Education Sciences and the WWC, I welcome you to this webinar. Today, we'll discuss the WWC's updates to the version 4.1 OSRG. As you all know, the OSRG is a vitally important tool for the conduct of the WWC, and therefore we are working alongside IES to ensure its use meets the needs of reviewers and those responsible for creating WWC products. Before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the Zoom platform we are broadcasting from for today's webinar. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see three icons: a Q&A, raise hand, and chat. If you have questions at any point during the webinar, please type your answer into the Q&A icon. At the end of the session, we will answer as many questions as we have time for. The webinar today will be led by two experts on the WWC's version 4.1 standards and the OSRG, Dr. David Miller and Dr. Josh Polanin. Doctors Miller and Polanin are both research methodologists with considerable expertise in quantitative research and meta-analysis. Dr. Miller is a researcher at AIR. For the WWC, he led the version 4.1 updates to the OSRG. He also contributes to the efforts to improve the WWC's effect size calculation procedures and cluster design standards. Dr. Polanin is a principal researcher at AIR and the project director for the SWOT contract. A few other notes about the Zoom platform. You have a few options for audio. You can either dial in or listen through your computer audio. You can click on the chat to view links and additional information shared by presenters, or to let us know if you're experiencing technical issues. Again, as I said previously, to ask questions of the presenters, please use the Q&A icon. And also, finally, we have live closed captioning that will be available during the webinar. To see the captions, click on closed caption. At the end of today's webinar, our goals are for participants to understand the key changes that have been implemented for the version 4.1 OSRG, to understand the guidance and implications for using the new input fields in the OSRG, and to be made aware of all of the resources that have been developed to help guide users in conducting reviews for the version 4.1 OSRG. The webinar will be presented in 4 parts. Part 1 will focus on entering effect size information in the version 4.1 OSRG. During Part 2, we will discuss changes to the cluster correction fields. Part 3 will focus on aggregating main findings within studies, including a live demonstration in the OSRG. And finally, in part 4, we will discuss synthesizing findings across studies. And with that, I will turn things over to David. David?
Thanks, Liz. With the version 4.1 WWC Procedures Handbook, the WWC now calculates standard errors that represent the uncertainty of intervention effect estimates. These standard errors are used to weight studies and cross-study syntheses and compute WWC p-values for individual study findings. A webinar last month covered the new statistical formulas in detail, and today's webinar specifically focuses on implications for official WWC reviewers using the OSRG to conduct version 4.1 reviews. First, we will cover updates on entering effect size information into the OSRG. We will review 3 general principles for choosing the effect size computation option. Then, we will demonstrate the new version 4.1 input fields for covariate adjusted comparisons using a specific study example involving multiple regression. As experienced OSRG users will already know, reviewers will select an option in the effect size computation drop-down menu shown here that determines which pieces of statistical information the OSRG will use in its computation. This slide reviews 3 general principles for choosing the computation option in that menu. Though these principles are not new to version 4.1, they are useful reminders and will help frame today's discussion. First, users should generally prefer approaches based on baseline covariate adjustment over those based on unadjusted comparisons. These adjustment options include regression models and analysis of covariance, or ANCOVA, which can offer increased precision and reduced bias in estimating intervention effects. Second, the lack of reported information may often constrain the computation choice. For instance, when using computation options based on regression coefficients, unadjusted standard deviations must always be entered to compute the WWC effect size. If those standard deviations are unreported, other computation options may be required instead. This point is especially important in version 4.1 because without an effect size, the finding cannot contribute to meta-analytic averages in cross-study syntheses. Third, reviewers should always select the dichotomous option or dichotomous outcomes, such as high school dropout or college graduation. Dichotomous outcomes require special formulas that do not apply to continuous outcomes. This table lists the major user-facing version 4.1 changes for each computation option. As shown here, the user interface for the first category of options, for unadjusted mean comparisons, has not changed from version 4.0 to 4.1. The third category, for dichotomous outcomes, also has not changed. Instead, the user-facing changes focus on the middle category for covariate adjusted comparisons, introducing several new input fields such as proportion variance explained or regression coefficient standard errors. Josh will now demonstrate these changes in the OSRG, showing where these new input fields appear and how to interpret them when entering values. He will also show new features for manually selecting attrition boundaries for version 4.1 reviews. Take it away, Josh.
Thanks, David. As Liz said, my name is Josh Polannon, and I'm the project director of the SWOT contract. It's really nice to talk to you all today, and it's great to see so many familiar names in the audience. As David said, we're really excited to demonstrate the updated version of the OSRG and showcase just some of its newest features. So the first demonstration follows the example that David just discussed, and I'm going to show how a reviewer will input and use a finding using the newly added regression coefficient and standard error fields in the OSRG. To do so, I've selected a study that the WWC has yet to review, but is one that might look familiar to folks today if you joined the previous webinar on the Handbook supplement. This first study was conducted by Stiers and Bard Wilkerson. It was published in 2011. It evaluated the effects of the Focus Math program on, among many other outcomes, math achievement using the Key 3 math measure. I've completed a sample review of this finding using the version 4.1 Standards and Procedures Handbook. The authors evaluated the program using a randomized controlled trial design, and the study had low attrition using the optimistic boundary. There were no other confounding factors, assignment wasn't compromised, and the Key 3 outcome measure met review requirements. So as a result, this finding and the resulting study review would of course meet WWC group design standards without reservations. Before I jump in and illustrate the new regression fields, I'd like to point out one other field that we just added that's new for version 4.1, and that's the attrition boundary. This field was added to accommodate the newly added study review protocol. So reviewers should be attentive to the attrition boundary that they use. Now, moving down below, let's look at the new regression fields. So you should start by selecting OLS from the drop-down menu. This will pre-populate the relevant fields for completion down below here. In this case, the authors provided a regression coefficient, its standard error, and a test statistic. I've entered all three into the appropriate fields. I've also entered down below here the unadjusted as well as the adjusted means, as well as the unadjusted standard deviations. The relevant info about the study's effect size, standard error, p-value, and statistical significance has all been entered as well, but that hasn't changed, so let's ignore it for now. So before I go and look at the effect size itself, I'd like to point out a few important aspects of the way the OSRG estimates this particular effect size. The first is that in order for the effect size to be estimated, as David said, the regression coefficient as well as the unadjusted standard deviation must be present. The second is that only 2 of the 3 of the coefficient, standard error, or test statistic need to be present in order for an effect size and its standard error to be estimated. If the test statistic and the standard error are missing, then the effect size will be estimated, but the new standard error formula will not be used. Finally, should the R-squared field be missing, as it is here, the OSRG assumes that the R-squared was in fact 0, and this will impact the size of the standard error. To demonstrate the impact of including the standard error, including the standard error has on the calculation of the effect size of standard error, we can include and remove it from the field and then view the effect size in the ratings page. Now, if we were to go and look at the ratings page right now, we'd notice that the effect size of standard error is 0.042. But if I go ahead and remove it, like so, and then click Save and Continue, and Save and Continue one more time, we will see that down here in the Measures section, the effect size was calculated as 0.090, but now the effect size is 0.107. So including that information can make a big difference in the calculation of the effect size and its standard error. One last thing regarding individual level studies, and I'll return to the measures page for this. Let's scroll down and look at one item that you may have noticed right here. This last question that says, did the analysis account for clusters? So it shows up even when a reviewer selects no above for cluster level assignment up here, right there. So this is a known issue, and we're working to address it. But you should be assured that when the answer to the cluster question above is indeed no, the answer to this question, does the analysis account for clusters, has no impact on the size of the effect or its standard error. We're working on a fix that'll be fixed in the next couple of months. But with that, I'll turn it back over to David to continue the webinar. David?
Thanks, Josh. We will end this section with 2 additional points about entering effect size information. The first is a caution about distinguishing the 2 t-test input fields now available. The t-test value that Josh showed in his example study came from a multiple regression model that controlled for covariates. As such, reviewers can enter this value in the coefficient test statistic field for regression-based computation options. However, reviewers should not enter this value or any other t-test value based on covariate adjustment into the input field for the t-stat computation option. The t-stat computation option is solely reserved for simple, unadjusted mean comparison. If reviewers mistakenly enter a covariate adjusted t-test value in for the t-stat computation option, then the WWC effect size will be calculated larger than it should be. And the second point we will end with in this section is noting the required fields for computing effect sizes. This table highlights the required fields for the covariate adjustment options we have been focusing on today. Notably, the new version 4.1 fields, such as the coefficient standard error, are generally not required to compute effect sizes, but reviewers should enter them in anyway to help improve the standard error calculations that the OSRG will apply. Next, we will cover changes to input fields regarding cluster corrections for cluster-level assignment studies, such as randomized experiments that assign entire groups of students, such as schools, to intervention conditions. Cluster-level assignment studies have special considerations for computing standard errors. Version 4.1 of the WWC Procedures Handbook and its supplement included several improved statistical formulas for these types of studies. And reviewers' answers to the question shown here, is this an analysis with cluster-level assignment, enable the OSRG to appropriately apply such formulas. In addition to incorporating these formulas, last month's updates to the OSRG included user-facing changes to relevant input fields that we will focus on in today's demonstration. We will demonstrate 3 user-facing changes listed here. First, the input field for did the analysis account for clusters question, as Josh showed, was moved to appear directly beneath the specific statistics such as F and T values it corresponds to. Second, an error was fixed that had prevented the OSRG from applying appropriate cluster corrections to WWC calculations in certain circumstances. third, the intra-cluster correlation field will now always appear for cluster-level assignment studies, regardless of the answer to the "Did the analysis account for clusters?" question. These user-facing changes were implemented last month along with the version 4.1 updates, but they also apply to earlier OSRG versions, such as version 4.0. Josh will now demonstrate these changes.
Thanks again, David. So let's turn now to another demonstration. And just like you said, demonstrate these new regression fields for a multi-level study. So our example for this one comes from a study by Rutherford and colleagues, published in 2014. Another study that the WWC has yet to review. The authors used a randomized controlled trial design, this time assigning schools to receive the intervention or participate as a business as usual comparison group. The authors assigned 30 schools to the intervention and 29 to the comparison group. 27 of those schools from the intervention group participated in the intervention, and 25 from the comparison group. The authors, however, did not provide the number of students assigned to each condition, and because this study is being used as an example only, of course, we didn't send out an AQ. Therefore, student level attrition cannot be estimated. The authors did, however, provide evidence of baseline equivalence on the analytic sample. So this study meets standards with reservations because there's no other overriding factors that would result in the study being rated does not meet group design standards. Okay, so to the questions at hand, you can see I've selected yes to the question of cluster level assignment here. Also known to the attrition boundary selection again, and I've selected yes for the optimistic attrition boundary. I'll mention here that for cluster level assignment studies, the attrition boundary also impacts the cluster level representativeness formula. So even in the cases of high attrition at the student level, like this particular study, it'll be important to select the correct attrition boundary as it will impact the cluster level as well. Moving down the OSRG, I've also entered an interclass correlation in the field here. If you were to look really closely at this study, I'll point out, the authors reported the pretest of 0.04, but they actually did not provide a post-test ICC. So therefore, I've entered the default value, the WWC's default value of 0.20 for a missing ICC. And it's important to enter this default value so that the OSRG doesn't assume the wrong value. Moving further down the OSRG now, no joiners were included, and the standard deviations were reported at the individual level. Like I said, I've entered the baseline equivalence information, and it largely hasn't changed from version 3.0 and 4.0, so I won't demonstrate that here. Okay, moving to the analysis section. I've made several selections that are worth noting. The first is that I've chosen the OLS selection from the effect size computation dropdown. So this is because the authors used robust standard errors within a traditional OLS framework to account for the school level clustering. If you were to select HLM2 level 2 here, the effect size and standard error estimations don't change, but you would want to ensure that the correct information is selected. In the future, we may work on additional formulas to discriminate between OLS models and HLM models. But for now, just make sure that the correct one is appropriate, or that you've selected the appropriate one. The second thing to note here is that I filled in the R² value right here, the regression coefficient, and its standard error. This is all information that has been reported by the study authors. And just like last time, I've completed, this time, the unadjusted means and the unadjusted standard deviations. Finally, and importantly for the computation of the effect size of standard error, I'll select yes for the answer of did the analysis account for clusters. The selection choice, yes or no, as David mentioned, can make a big impact on the computation. If you watched the Handbook supplement webinar back in November that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, you may remember that David presented two different formulas corresponding to these two options here. To demonstrate their impact, we can toggle back and forth and then go to the ratings page to view the effect size, just like we did in the last demonstration. When the yes value is correctly entered, the effect size and its standard error is 0.065 and 0.038, respectively. We'll look at that now. Click Save and Continue twice. And the effect size and its standard error are 0.065 and 0.038. Now, if we were to go back to this measure, edit it, and toggle to no for accounting for clusters, then press Save and Continue twice more, we will see that now the effect size is the same, 0.065, but the effect size is quite a bit larger, 0.279. So clearly getting this right can make a big difference. I want to end by mentioning that we've actually produced multiple resources to help guide reviewers in making these sometimes difficult decisions along the way. The first resource I'll mention is the Handbook Supplement webinar. And that webinar, along with the slides and the question and answer documentation, will all be archived on the WWC's resource webpage in the coming weeks. The second resource that I'll mention is the Summary of Changes document, which can be found in the OSRG resource library. This document in this row has questions that guide reviewers through this selection process. The third resource I'll mention is that we're working on the version 4.1 user's guide. This guide will also detail mechanisms to correctly select the appropriate choice. And while I'm talking about user's guides, I'll also note that we've produced several updated user's guides for version 3.0 and version 4.0. Those will be sent to reviewers and uploaded to this resource library in the coming weeks as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to David. David?
Thanks, Josh. All right, now we will demonstrate the version 4.1 changes for aggregating findings within a single study, which was one of the more complex user-facing version 4.1 changes. The OSRG provides two ways of aggregating multiple findings from a study. First, users can aggregate unadjusted means from two or more subsamples for a single outcome measure. For instance, a study could report unadjusted means separately for boys and girls for a specific mathematics test without reporting the means for the combined sample. This option remains the same from version 4.0 to 4.1. Second, the OSRG will automatically average effect sizes for multiple main findings in an outcome domain, accommodating both correlated outcome measures and subsample findings that cannot be aggregated using the first option. Only this second option changes with version 4.1. The major version 4.1 update is that reviewers can now enter correlations between main findings. The OSRG will incorporate these correlations into its computation of the domain-level standard error using statistical formulas new to version 4.1 of the WWC Procedures Handbook. Josh will now show this interface for entering correlations.
Thanks once again, David. Let's turn now to that third demonstration. Okay, so for this example, I'm going to switch study topics just a bit and discuss an evaluation of a cyberbullying program for middle school students. The program is called VISC, and it was evaluated by Granger and colleagues in 2015. And as with the other examples, the authors used a randomized controlled trial design. However, the authors did not provide student level assignments, so this is treated as a high attrition RCT. The authors did provide baseline equivalence information on all of the outcome measures, and no other factors would contribute to reduce the study rating. So this study will meet standards with reservations. Again, the WWC has not reviewed this study as of yet. I should also note that, unlike the other two studies, I'm massaging the study a bit to meet our demonstration needs. This study would not be eligible under the new study review protocol, not because of its design or its measures, but because it was conducted in Austria. Also, I'm going to demonstrate the updated outcome combination procedures by using the same outcome measures in two different scenarios. Despite these issues, though, we believe that illustrating the outcome combination procedures using real correlational data from a real study is worthwhile, and therefore found this study appealing for demonstration purposes. Okay, with those caveats in mind, let's turn now to the new combination procedures. I'll start with an example where only two findings need to be combined within an outcome domain. And for this example, those two measures will be observed within the student discipline domain. And if we scroll down, we'll look in this domain here. We can see we have these two measures of cyberbullying, self-reported cyberbullying perpetration, and self-reported cyberbullying victimization. I've added the requisite information for both the baseline and outcome measures already into the measures and the findings page. And one thing to note for this example, because these measures are about a student's negative behavior, a higher score is considered a worse outcome. Therefore, on the measures page, I've selected yes to the question of should the outcome be treated as worse. Although I'm not showing it here, the cyberbullying victimization has similar information. Okay, so with all this information added to the OSRG, let's turn now to the synthesis of findings within an outcome domain. And to start, I'll go up to the top of the page here. And at the top of the rating page, we will scroll to the summary of findings that meet standards table. And we'll observe the domain average for student discipline row. So as you might expect, and as David showed, to complete the new synthesis of findings procedure, click on this Add Correlation button on the far right-hand side. And after doing so, a pop-up window appears where reviewers can enter the appropriate correlation. For this particular outcome domain, the correlation between the two measures is 0.774, so I've entered it into the box here. Once we click Save, the OSRG recalculates the average effect size and its standard error. And if we scroll down the domain average for student discipline, we can see the average effect and its standard error. If we want to, for demonstration purposes, we could remove the correlation like so. Click Save. And now the OSRG will recalculate the domain average. By doing so, the OSRG assumes a correlation of 1.0, which our investigations on the WWC stat team revealed to be a conservative estimate when the correlation is missing. We can now see that the standard error for the domain level average is 0.165. It was originally 0.154. Okay, so this is a relatively simple example because there's only two findings. What about an example where there's 4 findings? So for that, we'll turn to the domain average for student behavior. And here I've coded, again, cyberbullying perpetration and victimization, But now I've added two additional findings, traditional aggression perpetration and traditional aggression victimization. I've listed all four findings within this student behavior outcome domain. So let's now look, let's return now to the summary of findings table and look at this first row, domain average for student behavior. Again, we click on the Add Correlation button, and this pop-up window appears. I'll also note that as more findings are added to a domain, you may want to expand to this box to see all of the correlations. All right, so this time 6 boxes appear representing the 6 possible bivariate correlations among the 4 findings. The order of the correlations is the order in which the findings are ordered down below on the ratings page. And for this example, that means that the first correlation is between traditional aggression perpetration and traditional aggression victimization, or 0.55. The next correlation is between the first finding listed and the third finding listed, or 0.45, and so on. Just as with the previous example, should any of these correlations be missing, or should all of the correlations be missing, the OSRG assumes a correlation of 1.0. And finally, for this case, I'll just note that the average effect size is slightly negative, only because worse effects were found for the traditional aggression perpetration and victimization measures. However, the standard error in this case is lower for this outcome domain compared to the student discipline domain, reflecting the fact that we have more information about the findings within this particular domain. Okay, and with that, I'll turn it back over to David to cover the final section of the webinar before my final demonstration. David?
Thanks, Josh. This graphic further illustrates how to interpret the OSRG correlation input fields for an example with multiple, more than 2 findings. The 3 boxes on the left side show what the OSRG would display for an outcome domain with 3 main findings. These boxes correspond to the lower left off-diagonal entries of the correlation matrix shown on the right side. And the ordering of values in the correlation matrix pop-up should match the order of the individual main findings as listed on the rating page as shown here. Next, we will cover changes for synthesizing findings across studies, starting with a brief reminder of version 4.1 changes for intervention effectiveness ratings, and then show additional display fields in the OSRG for version 4.1 syntheses. As a reminder for certified reviewers, the WWC formally adopted a meta-analytic framework for effect size synthesis in version 4.1. In this framework, more precisely estimated effects with smaller standard errors receive more meta-analytic weight. Smaller standard errors typically correspond to larger sample sizes. In addition to incorporating this meta-analytic approach, the OSRG for version 4.1 also includes the updated logic for qualitative intervention effectiveness ratings. These ratings depend on 3 factors: the number of studies, the meta-analytic average and its statistical significance, and the proportion of meta-analytic weights from studies with the highest WWC rating of meets WWC standards without reservation. The WWC Procedures Handbook details this updated rating logic in much more detail. This slide contrasts the summary of findings tables that the OSRG will automatically generate in version 4.0 versus 4.1 intervention reports. The version 4.1 table includes 2 new columns, for the meta-analytic average effect size and meta-analytic standard error. These values synthesize effect sizes across studies. In addition, the rating of effectiveness column now reflects the updated rating logic that the OSRG will apply. Josh will now show this user interface for generating syntheses in the OSRG.
Thanks again, David. One more time. So yeah, like you said, I'll showcase the new output associated with the meta-analytic average and standard error, as well as the intervention report effectiveness rating. A couple of notes to add on to what David's already said before I dive in. The first is that as of right now, the synthesis generation user interface looks exactly the same as it did in version 4.0 OSRG. In future updates, we may update the interface to accommodate the study review protocol or associated WWC products, but for now, the interface remains the same. The second note is that the OSRG does all of those updated analytics that David mentioned behind the scenes. So that means that the reviewer can do everything exactly the same as he or she did in the version 4.0 OSRG to generate new results. The third note is that I'm going to use a completely fake example this time around that includes only one study and one finding. However, this example does not reduce the output, and I can illustrate the new information just as the same as if it were a real example with 5 studies and 5 findings. The fourth and final note is that some users may not have access to the synthesis generation interface. Only users with a coordinator dashboard and super user access will be able to conduct the synthesis. So don't worry if you don't see this option right away within the OSRG. Okay, with all those notes in mind and with all those things out of the way, let's turn to generating a synthesis and observing the new output. So I've already clicked on content and then generate a new synthesis. Next, I'll select some information. So the OSRG will know what to synthesize. The example right now resides in the not applicable intervention type, mainly so that future WWC reviewers don't accidentally include our fake example. I'll select it here. I'll also select the newly added study review protocol down below here. I'll also select protocol version 4.1, standards version 4.1, and I'll just select SWOT audit for the purpose. Okay, then I'll click generate. Now, because the OSRG is calculating and pulling information from different tables and various sources, this is probably going to take a minute. So in the meantime, I'd like to remind us all that we will be looking at something very familiar to the version 4.0 OSRG, but with the expectation and the exception of additional information. We will see the effect size, and if this example were to include more than one study, the effect size would be from a fixed effects meta-analytic average. Next to that, we will see the effect size of standard error, and in the lower table, whether the effect size is statistically significant. Okay, so here's the synthesis generated, and we can see the information that I've mentioned. Here's the effect size, its standard error. The rating of effectiveness column over here is the intervention report effectiveness rating, which again, as David mentioned, is a combination of the information listed here, as well as the effect sizes, statistical significance down here in this row. The rest of this information should look largely familiar and mostly unchanged, save for a few small formatting differences. I'd like to end one more time by mentioning the OSRG resources library. Again, there's lots of great information on this page, and you can get there by clicking search and then search resources. I just mentioned the study review protocol. The study review protocol now lives here in this row. And we plan to update the WWC's protocol website in the coming weeks to add it, so it'll be available there as well. There's a lot of other useful information. We just added an infographic yesterday that highlights further highlights some of the changes. And there's information about OSRG access and how to upload various documents and various templates down here. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Liz to close up the main portion of the webinar and turn to the Q&A. Liz?
Thank you so much, Josh. And thanks to both of you, David and Josh, for sharing that helpful information and expanding our understanding of the version 4.1 OSRG. I want to again remind and invite participants that if they have questions, that they can type them into the Q&A box by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many questions as we can during our time. I know that there's been quite a few that have been answered so far. And as a reminder, the lengthier forthcoming 4.1 Users Guide will address many of the initial questions that we get from users. We also received quite a few questions before the webinar today. So what I'm going to do is turn to those now. I will go ahead and start by asking the first one. So what is the process for copying reviews conducted under 4.0 standards to 4.1 standards in the OSRG? Do these reviews need to be finalized before they can be copied?
Yeah, I can take that. So the OSRG resources library includes a document, how to copy data from existing reviews, that details the review copy process. As described there, the existing review must first be finalized. Hence, if you have an in-progress 4.0 review, you must first finish it under 4.0 standards before being able to copy it for 4.1 standards. All of the 4.0 users' entries will be retained, but there will be a new 4.1 specific fields, such as the manual selection of attrition boundaries, for you to enter in as well. Otherwise, there are no special considerations for copying from 4.0 to 4.1. I also wanted to address a question that has come in the Q&A chat box that gets at some related functionality. So it's, will the synthesis function work for practice guides that don't focus on a single intervention? And if so, how? By the protocol selected? And so the current workaround that I have seen currently for handling practice guides is that you would have, you could create now with the existing functionality, you could create an intervention that is an intervention in the OSRG that is the practice guide name. So that would enable the OSRG to group all of those studies together. Now, if you have reviews that are already conducted, let's say that it has a variety of reviews already conducted, one with one intervention name and the other with a different intervention name, what you could do with the current functionality is use the copy review functionality to then create versions of the review that have a different intervention name. We realize that this is likely a complex interface currently, and so we will be considering further improvements and enhancements in the coming months to address that. But I first at least wanted to mention that as an option for how to handle that issue with the existing functionality that exists now as is.
Great, thank you so much, David. Another question that came in is, can I manually select which studies will be part of a synthesis?
Yeah, I'll address that one, Liz. David addressed some of this already in the last comment, but specifically for studies or findings within a study, there's no way to manually select individual studies or individual findings. But as David just mentioned, a workaround is for reviewers to copy each study they want to include as part of the synthesis to a single intervention or an outcome domain, and then rerun the synthesis generation process. And so, again, like David said, we know this is functionality that may be needed for future products, so we'll be working on it in the coming year.
Thank you so much, Josh. The next question is, will the version 4.1 OSRG include notes on the rating page describing which effect size standard error calculation was used? This would help reconcilers confirm that reviewers coded the outcome measures correctly.
Yeah, so the outcome details tables on the rating page of the OSRG will include footnotes about the option that the reviewer selected in the effect size computation drop-down menu, such as whether or not the reviewer selected the OLS coefficient option. In many cases, the effect size computation option also directly corresponds to the standard error formula that the OSRG will use. In some cases, however, the OSRG's application of standard errors may depend on other information as well. The table notes in the OSRG currently do not indicate fine-grained distinctions about the specific standard error formulas that were used, but reviewers may consult Appendix E of the WWC Procedures Handbook, version 4.1, and its supplement to better understand the underlying logic that the OSRG uses to compute standard errors.
Great, thank you, David. A couple more questions here. The next one is, if the authors provide a regression coefficient and test statistic, do not provide an R-square value or standard error, but provide the means and standard deviations, what effect size option should I select and what information should I provide?
Yeah, a lot going on in that study, Liz. I'll take this one. So in this example, WWC reviewers should prioritize the regression coefficient and therefore the OLS option over the unadjusted means and standard deviations option. David mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, but a good reminder. This is true even if the R-squared is missing. In the case of the R-squared being missing, the OSRG simply assumes a value of 0. In addition, should a test statistic or the standard error be available, the OSRG can use either piece of information to estimate the effect size of standard error. Also, as we noted in the webinar, reviewers should continue to fill in the means and standard deviation fields. That standard deviation field, of course, is used to estimate the effect size, and the means field may be used for reporting purposes on the WWC website or other WWC products.
Great, thank you, Josh. The next question is, how would you approach a situation in which the authors of a study reported an effect size, but it could not be replicated using the information provided for the study? For example, if the Works Clearinghouse calculated an effect size based on the information provided for the study, but it differed from the author reported effect size.
Yeah, I can answer that. So the WWC generally reports the WWC calculated effect size because its computation can be verified and it supports comparability across outcomes and studies. However, in some cases, the WWC will use the study reported effect size if all the following conditions are true. The study calculated the effect size consistent with the WWC formula for Hedges G, including a small sample adjustment for continuous outcomes. Second, the study reported effect size was based on covariate adjusted estimates, and the WWC calculated effect size was not, or the WWC calculated effect size was based on a post hoc difference in difference adjustment. And third, the study used the Cox index for dichotomous outcomes if appropriate. Whether the WWC uses the study reported effect size or the WWC calculated effect size, reviewers should still enter in the study reported values into the OSRG, because the WWC will report this supplemental information in the data from individual studies database.
Great, thank you so much, David. I believe last question that we're going to have time for is, are there resources available to describe the updates and the various intricacies of the new OSRG functionality?
The short answer is yes, Liz. Good question. We've created multiple resources to help WWC reviewers and the review teams. As I mentioned and as I demonstrated on the OSRG's resource library, there are several documents available, including a summary of changes document, which articulates many of the new features and how they work, an aggregating findings document, which details how to use the WWC's new aggregation of subsample or multiple main findings procedures. We also plan to release updated OSRG users guides for version 3.0 and 4.0 in the coming weeks. And we're working on a version 4.1 users guide, which is slated for release later by the end of March or later this spring. There's also a question about which resources will be made publicly available. We haven't determined if all of the resources will be made publicly available quite yet, but I can tell you that the study review protocol will be made publicly available on the WWC's protocol website within the next week or within the next few weeks or month. Liz?
Okay. Thank you so much, Josh and David, for answering those questions. This concludes our time for today. I'd like to thank again our presenters, David and Josh, for an engaging and informative webinar. I'd also like to thank participants for joining us today as we expanded our understanding of the version 4.1 OSRG. Just as a reminder, the WWC SWAT team engages in webinars throughout the year to highlight important aspects of the WWC, and we have several webinars in the works for 2021. We will also be posting an archive of the webinar along with the Q&A, including responses to questions that we weren't able to cover today on the Works Clearinghouse resource page. And if you have any additional questions, please consult the user's guide, which can be found in the OSRG resource library. If you aren't able to find an answer to your question in the user's guide, feel free to email the WWC's help desk. And with that, I thank you again for joining us today.